All right, so this is going to be a black screen podcast style response video because I'm currently in New Mexico and don't have my camera, but I wanted to get this out before it becomes completely irrelevant. First, I wanted to welcome all my new subs. Hello, thank you so much for subscribing, even though my debate skills are mediocre. Of course, there are so many things I could have said in hindsight, but given I was pretty nervous to do a live debate in front of 30,000 plus people, I don't think I totally embarrassed myself, so that's cool. When I told Leanna, the tofu goddess, I was going to debate vegan gains, her advice was to be sure to define my terms, not let him strawman me or try and steer the conversation. It was great advice, but easier said than done. So here I am making a response video to better articulate my position, clarify a few things, and highlight some of Richard's fallacious arguments that I failed to call him out on in the moment. Before we get into specifics, I wanted to address a few things. Number one, I never thought I was the best person to debate Richard on this topic. I would love to see him debate someone like Mexi because that girl knows her shit. I still have a huge stack of books to read on the topic of capitalism, and that is why I admitted that my knowledge is limited. But I do have a basic understanding of intersectionality, and it's pretty clear that Richard does not. So I thought it would be interesting to have a conversation with him and a good way to get some exposure. And it's not like I could orchestrate a debate between him and Mexi. Another thing I want to point out is that you really can't define movements or theories based on the people who identify with said movement or theory. Take the term environmentalist, for example. Many vegans will say you can't call yourself an environmentalist if you eat meat. While I agree that it is hypocritical for an environmentalist to eat meat, if a person is concerned about or advocates for the protection of the environment, they are an environmentalist as per the definition. The same can be said about intersectionalists. I, for one, think it is hypocritical for intersectionalists to disregard non-human animals in their fight for social justice, but if they identify with the definition and understand the complex, cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalized individuals or groups, they are an intersectionalist. If you had to be 100% morally consistent to be classified as an environmentalist or an intersectionalist, there would be no one left. Someone left a fantastic comment that I'm just going to read because I think it summarizes the debate perfectly. You are strawmanning intersectionality as a belief in a monstrous conglomerate of intentionally orchestrated oppressions that all relate to every single other oppression in every way imaginable. Intersectionality is just the notion that other oppressions can be interlinked, and so advocacy should be orchestrated with that in mind so as not to disenfranchise minorities or other recipients of discrimination. You don't have to be for every issue to say that these two or this multitude of issues are interwoven and have some overlaps to take into consideration for advocacy or lawmaking. Not all intersectionalists are good people, just as not all vegans are good people. A few great examples of this are John Rowe's Sexy Vegan, and even in some respects, in terms of your immaturity, insensitive activity, and attitude, you, Richard. The fact that there are some bad apples in the bunch does not make any of those bad actors reflective of the whole. Intersectionalists can be pieces of shit, but that doesn't mean there is something intrinsic to intersectionality that makes them that way. You are guilty of the same stereotyping of intersectionalists that meat eaters and the media direct at vegans. There are many divisive intersectionalists who purity test one another, just as there are divisive vegans who purity test one another. This isn't intrinsic to either, and it isn't inherently a bad thing. In some ways, it is positive for discourse as it shapes our activism in a more clear and concise way than it would be otherwise if there wasn't internal critique. Thank you so much, Rockyo, for your very eloquent take. Richard now has a second debate on intersectionality on his channel with Bosch, who apparently didn't bother watching the first debate, but whatever. And in the first 20 minutes, Richard totally misrepresents my position.
You said you wanted to talk about intersectionality and everything, so Yeah,
I'm up to
I feel
talk.
like I'm pretty qualified to talk about it because I have a sociology degree. And nowadays, intersectionality is more or less the bedrock of sociological critical theory. If you go to school and you learn like about sociological theory, it's almost always being done through the lens of intersectionality. I've never heard a person say that they're in favor of anti-racism, abortion rights, women's liberation, all of the components of progressive thought, but then turn around and say they're not in favor of this sort of binding theory that unifies them into like a collective critical mass. So that's interesting to me. Let's talk about it. I guess the main thrust of intersectionality, I guess, is the idea that the power structures that lead to the oppression of group A along a given axis, let's say race or gender or what have you, is usually synchronous with other power structures which exist to oppress other marginalized communities. So, for example, like women get shit on, in a variety of ways, disproportionate, da 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 da, less representation, what have you, and that's bad. And being gay, usually nets you some added level of stress. Less so now in more progressive areas, but it's definitely still a thing. But being a gay woman means you now have this. There are specific problems at the interstice between these two axes. Like a gay woman, like a lesbian woman, would deal with particular problems, like for example, like getting called like a dyke or a butcher, what have you, or being chastised for not living up to the roles associated with femininity, like bearing a child or like taking care of a strong man. And those things exist at that point and that point only, and they can only exist because there are dual power structures that kind of overlap at that section. You know what I mean?
Okay, so when I debated this woman, I think her name was Christina. I'm really bad with remembering names, but she kind of explained it in a different way. She was explaining it in a way where she was suggesting these lines of oppression, they're interrelated, and if you take down one line of oppression, it's basically like this web where if you untangle one web, it like the whole web kind of breaks down. The way you're explaining it is a bit different, where you're saying there are different forms of oppression like sexism and homophobia, and they can intersect each other, and people can deal with two forms of oppression at the same time.
Yeah,
So,
and that they sort
okay.
of reflect off one another. There's this discursive element between those two axes, which leads to a specific a juncture that leads to specific problems for the people who occupy that space.
Okay, that explanation makes a lot more sense to me. Now, I will say personally that most of the intersectionalists I've dealt with, they don't really use that sort of explanation to define intersectionality.
I've found that there are a lot of people online, and this is I'm not trying to sound like condescending to them or anything like
Yeah.
that, but I have found that there are a lot of people online who are progressive, and it's good that they're progressive. But they they express their political views by misappropriating academic terminology, and it can make it really difficult to clear up what exactly anyone means when you start having people talk about like the discursive realities and talk about like intersectionality critical theory, and you have no idea if they're using the academic definition or if they just heard it and it sounded woke, so they started like throwing it out there.
Just to clarify, you're not saying that these different forms of oppression, they're somehow interrelated to each other, where if you got rid of one, the other will like kind of collapse?
I think actually I would take the opposite position. I would say that if you got rid of one without getting rid of the other, that other one that still exists would seek to fill in the holes that were left through the absence of the axis of oppression you just removed. This is, I don't know if it's ever happened to you. I've been told this happens fairly frequently, at least in my experience. It makes sense intuitively. Like, a lot of fucking black guys, especially big ones, you're a pretty big boy, often get this, like, uneasy feeling in public that other people are, like, nervous to be around them, like, particularly, like, white women, because, and you don't know, like, is it because I'm, like, a big guy, or is it because I'm black and they're kind of like tetchy about that? And it's this weird intersection because being a guy isn't enough there. It's not enough to just be a guy to elicit that reaction, and also not to be black, because black women don't get treated that way. It's the point between the two. And if you took away one of those axes, if you could suddenly like remove sexism from the equation, like there was perfect parity between the sexes, genders, complete equality, racism would still kind of fill in that gap, and you'd be experiencing the same problem because you failed to substantively address the entirety of the problem. You've only gotten rid of one leg of the chair. The chair's still over you, you know?
Okay, I see what you're saying.
I won't deny that Bausch explained this in a more succinct way, but I am truly flabbergasted that this is how Richard is characterizing my position after our 2.5 hour long discussion. I'm going to play a few clips from my debate to illustrate that my position isn't really out of alignment with what this other guy is saying. Yeah, so I guess I would just define intersectionality. I think the historical context is important because it was coined by this woman, Kimberly Crenshaw, who was like a black feminist scholar. And she was basically making the argument that as a black woman, given that she was discriminated based on gender and based on race, like as a black woman, she would have a unique experience of oppression that's different from a white middle class woman or a male black person. So that was like her thesis. And then it kind of like evolved to how we understand it today, which is just like you were saying, it doesn't make sense to be both racist and or if you're against homophobia. Basically, just understanding that when fighting against the oppression of one group, we shouldn't be perpetuating the oppression of another group.
The point I'm making is, this is a belief that I've seen among a lot of intersectionalists, where they think that, like we were talking about this before the stream, like there are essentially root causes to these forms of oppression. So they might pick something like racism. If we could deal with racism, then something like homophobia or sexism will pretty much go away because they're tightly interlinked somehow. So if you convince somebody not to be racist, they'll then in turn not be homophobic or not be sexist.
That's just why I think it's important to be an intersectionalist, because like if you look at history with the women's rights movement, like there were, I guess, intersectionalists back then who fought for universal suffrage. But then there were a lot of feminist leaders that were like wealthy white women who used racist rhetoric to advance their cause. And the point of intersectionality is to not perpetuate this oppression while trying to like advance one cause, if that makes sense. So that's my understanding of it, is that like Martin Luther King was an intersectionalist. He has that famous quote, like, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Why don't you define intersectionality? Because really the way you're defining intersectionality is just having multiple political interests.
Yeah, it's a complex, cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination combine, overlap, and intersect.
Yeah.
Especially the experience of marginalized individuals or groups. So, like, classism is a good example of how classism intersects with racism, because, like, there's a reason why white people own most of the wealth and, like, black people are disproportionately poor. We all have, like, totally different experiences in the world based on, like, our set of privileges or disadvantages. Like,
sure.
That's the argument, that like a black woman will have a different experience in life than a white woman. The argument is just that this is all complex and that there's all these problems in the world. And if you look at like what's causing a lot of these problems, you can kind of like dwindle it down to othering.
Okay, if you're against one form of oppression, you should also be against a similar form of oppression, even if it's this oppression is happening to a group that isn't even in your social circle. Now, that's different from intersectionality in the way that you're not actually linking these forms of oppression. You're just showing that ethically they're very similar. an intersectionalist would take it to the level that, okay, are you, would you be in favor of killing somebody who's mentally retarded? They would say no. Okay, then an intersectionalist would say, okay, then why would you be in favor of killing animals that have a similar level of intelligence to these mentally retarded people? And then they'd go on to claim there's somehow this direct interaction and link between marginalizing mentally disabled people and marginalizing animals. And if we stopped the animal agriculture industry, somehow that would give mentally disabled people more rights, there'd be more funding to help them. That doesn't make any sense. There's no link between these two things. So,
I wouldn't say that the link is necessarily like super strong in all of these cases. That's not what I'm arguing. The reason I think intersectionality is an effective strategy is because it's most logical to be against all of these things, like forms of oppression, and to fight against all forms of oppression. And if you can just explain that you're against othering and you're against discrimination based on arbitrary characteristics, that kind of covers everything, you know?
But when it comes to actual activism and thinking about things practically, it just doesn't make sense to attach feminism, anti-capitalism, and everything else you could think of, any other kind of form of oppression, onto veganism when really all you want to be arguing for is veganism. It just makes it harder to argue for these things.
Would you agree that Martin Luther King should not have been vocal about his stance against the Vietnam War because other social...
Look, that's not intersectionalism.
But it is, because he
No.
is recognizing that these systems are affecting people all over the world, and he's like taking into consideration like all of these marginalized groups, not just black people, not just black people in America where he lives. Like, he's considering the global, like the whole picture, and that's why he was adamant against the war. And then people said, oh, that's not effective, you need to stay on message, just talk about like civil rights in America, like don't bring up all this other stuff, like you're going to alienate people that are for the war against your cause. But it's like, I still think that it was correct of him to stand his ground and fight against the war, you know?
Okay, look, again, just because somebody advocates for different social justice issues, that doesn't actually make them intersectionalist. Like, again, the idea behind intersectionality is all of these forms of oppression are interrelated, intersect, and possibly even have a root cause. So just because he's against the Vietnam War, that doesn't mean he thinks somehow that's interrelated to black oppression. And maybe on some level it is.
There's a reason why he's against the war. It's because of his
worldview,
which is intersectional.
Well, look, no, the Vietnam War was just complete bullshit. Like, why would you support murdering people you don't know in another country just so that, you know, big businesses make more money? Like, there's no sense.
Right.
It was pointless.
And that is interconnected with capitalism. It's like the U.S. government makes money off of war somehow. The military-industrial complex is like...
Well, yeah, sure, I would agree with that, but the
reason we went to war is because we were terrified of communism. So that's like to uphold capitalism. That's why we went to war. So like that's definitely interlinked.
Okay, well, the thing is, again, I don't actually see how that's an example of intersectionality. Like, okay, all you're doing is pointing out like a particular issue with capitalism where it does support foreign wars.
And that's how they're interlinked, like how all of these human rights abuses all over the world and animal rights abuses, like they don't all exist in a vacuum. Like they have like impacts on each other, and there's not necessarily a direct link between every single form of oppression in all instances.
Okay.
I just kind of view intersectionality as seeing like the big picture and looking at all of these things, all these problems, and how they affect marginalized groups, and
yeah, sure, like
having the desire to not perpetuate the problem in other areas while you're fighting against
all of those
area. That's like my whole definition of intersectionality.
Okay, well, that that differs a little bit from the established definition of intersectionality. I think I'd agree with you there, but it sounds like you're going by a different definition of intersectionality.
Well, it's the
Like
definition was
again,
coined, and then
oh,
another concept came out of that, and like that's
oh,
how it's understood in like activist circles. Okay, so here's where I'm confused. Richard is arguing that he agrees with my overall point, but he thinks I am defining intersectionality incorrectly, and that the quote established definition is that all of these forms of oppression are directly linked, and if you eliminate one form, all of the other forms will crumble. I explained ad nauseum that this is not my position, gave the historical context of the term, and then defined how it is best understood in activist circles today. If you compare my understanding of intersectionality with Bausch's understanding, it's not totally off base. It is clear that Richard had no clue what the established definition is, because when Bausch explained it, he was like, oh, that makes sense. What frustrates me is that at the end of the first live stream, he summarizes my view fairly correctly, which I'll play in a second. Yet in his discussion with Bausch, he totally misses the mark in the way he characterizes my position.
Wesley the G donated $5. He says, "If we have socialism, there would be no racism, sexism, meat eaters, or pollution. Everything will be wonderful. How can a person be so naive?" Well, she didn't actually believe that. It's just that that is kind of a belief that's held by a lot of intersectionalists. She seemed a lot more reasonable, and honestly, her beliefs didn't even sound like intersectionalism to me. It just sounded like she has this general opinion that people don't really tend to think of a lot of different things. They tend to maybe focus on one or two sort of political or ethical issues and don't consider how some of these things might be interrelated, or some of the reasons they support one form of oppression might be hypocritical. I don't think that's really intersectionality. It doesn't seem like she really believes that these topics are these social justice issues are actually directly interrelated. So when I debated this woman, I think her name was Christina. I'm really bad with remembering names, but she kind of explained it in a different way. She was explaining it in a way where she was suggesting these lines of oppression, they're interrelated, and if you take down one line of oppression, it's basically like this web where if you untangle one web, it like the whole web kind of breaks down.
As you can see, I never said that if you get rid of one form of oppression, all the other forms will collapse. What I'm saying is we need to address the root cause of these problems in order to dismantle them all. And there isn't necessarily one root cause to all the world's problems, but intersectionality is about taking a holistic approach and identifying these root causes so that we can tackle them. The root cause of racism, sexism, and speciesism would be discrimination based on arbitrary characteristics, and the root cause of environmental destruction would be perhaps the concept of extractivism, which is essentially the opposite of sustainability. It's the delusion that there are no limits to what we can extract from the earth. And we can see in the real world the many problems that have manifested from these toxic mentalities and how they interact with each other. The example I gave was environmental injustice, that people of color are disproportionately impacted by pollution from destructive industries. This is not just a coincidence. Yes, the reason these industries choose these sites to dump their waste is because the people in the surrounding areas are impoverished and lack the resources to fight back. So they are motivated by money, not necessarily racism. But there is a reason why people of color are disproportionately poor, and that reason is racism. It is important to make the distinction between racism and systemic racism. From Wikipedia, institutional racism is distinguished from racial bigotry by the existence of institutional systemic policies, practices, and economic and political structures which place minority racial and ethnic groups at a disadvantage in relation to an institution's racial or ethnic majority. It is expressed in the practice of social and political institutions. It is reflected in disparities regarding wealth, income, criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, political power, and education, among other factors. While individual racism is often identifiable because of its overt nature, institutional racism is less perceptible because of its less overt, far more subtle nature. Institutional racism originates in the operation of established and respected forces in the society, and thus receives far less public condemnation than individual racism. The fact that capitalists dump waste disproportionately on communities of color is an undeniable example of systemic racism. It is a prime example of where two forms of discrimination, race and class, intersect. Another important distinction to be made is the difference between capitalism and socialism. We have this oversimplified understanding that capitalism is private ownership and communism is government ownership. But these are philosophies. In the real world, there is no country that is operating under pure capitalism or pure communism. The US has a mixed economy that leans more towards capitalism, whereas Sweden has a mixed economy that leans more towards socialism. Even China has a private sector, it's just very limited. The thing about China is that while much of the means of production are publicly owned, it is essentially state capitalism. The state hoards all the wealth, and the people of China do not have a say, as it is not a democracy. The ideal of communism is workers owning the means of production and collectively making decisions. It is communalism. Right from the start, Richard builds a straw man by giving examples of morally inconsistent people. But this is not an argument against intersectionality. He seems to think that to be an intersectionalist, you must agree with every single political opinion of other intersectionalists, and fails to acknowledge that intersectionalists have ideological differences. At one point, he argues that by tacking on all of these other things, the message gets muddied. But the message of intersectionality is pretty clear. I mean, let's be morally consistent, value sustainability, and not discriminate based on arbitrary characteristics. You can still do focused activism as an intersectionalist. Of course, it would be inappropriate for me to show up to a Black Lives Matter protest and make it about animals, but that doesn't mean that Black Lives Matter shouldn't be intersectional. When I brought up gentrification, he argued that it just makes business sense, and was like, well, isn't it better to gentrify an area with a vegan restaurant than a non-vegan restaurant? Of course this would be better, but it doesn't make gentrification okay.
So you mentioned gentrification. I know this was made... Vice News did this horseshit where they were trying to attack Doomy's Mythology and I think some other vegan restaurant that was opening up in that area, where they were saying, oh, they're gentrifying the area, these fancy upscale restaurants are coming in and they're going to push out people who are low income. Well, that's not specifically a vegan issue. I mean,
Right.
the fact is, rent is really expensive in Toronto. So for a restaurant to open up in a poorer neighborhood where the rent is cheaper, it just makes business sense. And since Toronto is pretty small, there's good public transit everywhere. You don't really need to be in the downtown core to be successful. So why should it be a issue for a vegan restaurant to open up in an area like that when that's just the nature of business? Like, any restaurant could have opened up in that area. Why the hell should I care if my restaurant could possibly gentrify an area when literally any other business could open up there and do the exact same thing? And look, that's another issue with this intersectionality crap. Okay, so, are you saying it's a bad thing for a vegan restaurant to open up? So
Not
now...
necessarily, but
Well, right, but, look, and this was... I saw this being debated over Facebook because of the Vice News article, oh, Doomies shouldn't open up there, it's bad for the neighborhood, and really, a lot of the crap they were saying was horseshit. You can get, a $15 meal there, it's not that big of a deal. But a lot of people are saying, oh, there's so many poor people who can't even afford to eat there, it's bad for their psyche. And these were vegans who were saying this crap. So, again, here are intersectionalists who are actually trying to damage a vegan business just because of other beliefs they have.
to be honest, my brain just completely crapped out here, but it's pretty obvious that someone else might do it anyway is not a justification for doing something. Saying that's just the nature of business shows how capitalism prioritizes profit over people. An ethical business owner has the goal of having a positive impact on the community, as well as making a living for themselves, rather than just maximizing profit. If you wanted to open a vegan restaurant in a low-income area, you could make it a point to hire people in the community rather than just white people who commute. And of course, you could have affordable options on the menu. $15 for a meal is not exactly cheap. And you deleted a lot of your videos, so I can't really give like specific examples. I do remember one where you were joking about how black women are obnoxious on the subway. Like that's perpetuating like a negative stereotype against black women. But like you can see how that's like offensive, and for an organization like VegFest,
well,
like,
look,
I think they have every right to deplatform.
No. Look, it's like a joke is a joke, and I think this is another thing that you do see with intersectional activists, where minor jokes are seen as a form of oppression, and based on the ideology itself, no form of oppression can be tolerated at any level. Like, that's the logical conclusion. So even if you're like a normal person who just makes jokes online, okay, well, blacklisted, everybody should recognize you as a Nazi. Like, look, what color am I?
I get it, like, but like, you can't...
what are they? The Wayans brothers. They make the same sort of jokes. They're blacker than I am. Like, they're full black. The Wayans brothers, they make those comedic movies. They do the same thing. They dress up as black women and they act like really loud and obnoxious. It's just like a well-known stereotype.
Okay, look, I'm not the joke police. I get that most jokes are based on stereotypes, and that's why they're funny. Male comedians make jokes about women, female comedians make jokes about men. It's entirely dependent on the context. I think you can joke about any subject, including rape, if it's done in a tasteful way. I just remember watching that video where he made a joke about black women being obnoxious on the subway and thinking it was distasteful. Making jokes at the expense of particularly marginalized groups when you don't belong to that group seems to cross the line in my opinion. We all cringed when Trump mocked a disabled reporter because making fun of disabled people is not cool. I would say that perpetuating negative stereotypes about black women also isn't cool. Call me an SJW if you want. It's funny how the people who proclaim to be against identity politics use identity politics when it suits them. Black conservatives do this all the time. He brings up the fact that he's half black and says the Wayans brothers do it too, as if this is a justification for making insensitive jokes about black women. On the surface, there are all of these double standards. For example, black people can say the N-word, but it's unacceptable for white people to say it no matter the context. And why is there Black History Month but no White History Month? Black lives matter, but all lives matter. But because black people have been oppressed by white people for so long, if you examine these things with nuance, you will see that each one is a false double standard. This is a complicated subject because comedy is subjective, but I think power dynamics are important to consider in comedy. Like, pick on someone your own size. Make fun of people who deserve to be made fun of. He kept diminishing the significance of his actions by saying these are harmless jokes and minor disagreements. It would be wrong for VegFest to deplatform people based on minor disagreements, such as whether or not it's ethical to purchase the Impossible Burger. But calling people retarded and autistic and making fun of black women, these aren't harmless jokes. The thing is, there's a difference between overt and subtle racism. I personally don't find it productive to label people racist unless they are overtly racist. But even among overt racists, there is a gradient. Many racists do not think they're racist. Donald Trump, for example, is pretty overtly racist, but even he isn't on the same level as a self-proclaimed white supremacist, proud KKK member. Trump's tweets telling non-white congresswomen who were born in the United States to go back to their countries is a pretty clear example, among many, that he is a racist, yet he denies accusations of racism. I would not put Richard in the same category as Trump, so I wouldn't say he is racist, but subtle racism is not insignificant. Perpetuating negative stereotypes about black women is racially insensitive, and jokes like these aren't totally harmless, as he claims.
The one woman who was vegetarian at the thing, did you see the video where I argued with her? Yeah, she even admitted herself, she's on the board, she's an intersectionalist. After I put out that video, Lo and behold, all the people on Facebook, including that Weasley asshole Darren Chang, he was saying that, oh, what I did was horrible. I'm silencing an intersectionalist voice. I'm a fucking male, like, speaking down on a woman, and this is where it fucking leads to. I can't even do vegan activism. It's now shameful because I'm criticizing a female intersectional activist. It's ridiculous.
I would say that was just like inappropriate. You know what I mean?
What do you mean?
Like the way you called her out. Like, I will admit, I thought it was kind of funny just because, like, I agree.
How is that inappropriate?
Because they asked you to sit down and you kept talking.
So?
Like, that is, like, socially not acceptable.
Why? Well, who cares?
I mean, I'm just saying, like, your actions and behavior are going to have consequences. Like, if you don't, like, would you say that you behave in, like, a professional manner?
What do you mean?
Like, what you posted, that conversation that you had with that woman at Veg Fest. Like,
yeah, that's totally reasonable.
I agree that you were correct in your argument, but that doesn't mean that you were, like, behaving, like, in the most effective way. You know what I mean?
No,
like,
I think it was totally effective. I embarrassed her completely.
What outcome do you expect to come out of that, though?
Public embarrassment. And maybe she'll think twice about, announcing that she's vegetarian. She actually claimed she's a proud vegetarian.
Yikes.
Doubt she'll ever fucking say that again.
I agree. So that's where, like, I agree with you, because I agree that she shouldn't have been given a platform, because how can you call yourself an intersectionalist, be speaking at a Veg Fest, and not be vegan? Like, that doesn't make sense. I think that you were correct, but, like, you can be, like, arrogant and correct. You know, like, you can be rude and condescending and correct.
We've heard your point. Thank you for your point. We're asking you to sit down now, please.
Okay, well, she hasn't answered the question. Why do you support the unnecessary...
Responding to your question.
No, she didn't. No, she didn't. She just said she was at a certain point in her journey. No, she just said she was at a certain point in her journey, and I'm asking her, after 5 years of being vegetarian, why is it that you have not been able to discover how to not unnecessarily harm, exploit, rape, murder cows and chickens?
Does anyone else have a question while we're trying to get...
Do you have any... Yeah, do you have...
Yes,
okay, so do you have... No, do you have an actual excuse? You're a hypocrite. You're a hypocrite. You're a moral hypocrite. You have no reason... No, you have no reason. You have no reason to cause the unnecessary suffering, death, exploitation of animals. No, you're pathetic. No, guess what? No, guess what? Guess what? Guess what? The animals that you cause the unnecessary death, suffering, exploitation of, they have no choice. They cannot run away from what you do to them. You are pathetic. You're running away from what I'm asking you. So you're telling me the way I'm speaking to you is worse than how you treat animals? You're saying rape, murder, and exploitation is better than how I'm treating you?
So can you please anyone on the panel wants to speak to some of
Right, exactly. So you're a dishonest coward. No, you're a dishonest coward and a moral hypocrite, especially since you talk about intersectionality. Yeah, especially since you talk about intersectionality. You're pathetic.
To quote Richard, "It was totally effective. I embarrassed her completely." Here's the thing, though, he probably didn't. He really just embarrassed himself, considering how aggressive he was being and socially inappropriate the whole thing was. Don't get it twisted, I'm not against disruptive protests. It depends on the nature of the disruption. Again, I agree that this woman was a hypocrite and didn't belong on stage, but Richard has no reason to believe his actions were effective in this circumstance. Joey Carbstrong is a great example of someone who now sees the importance of being effective rather than just right. He did some self-reflection and recognized that his aggressive approach was not effective for the animals, and his advocacy has changed as a result of this realization. Richard holds a double standard here, complaining about intersectionalists blacklisting him and publicly shaming him for his insensitive rhetoric. Yet he thinks that publicly shaming this woman was effective activism. Of course, he could point out that he is right about this woman being a hypocrite and that Darren Chang is wrongfully accusing him of being a racist or whatever, but I'm talking about his claim that his behavior here was effective. Richard expresses his disdain for these SJWs who are super eager to blacklist people throughout the video. But as Mike the Vegan pointed out in the live chat, intersectionality is not the same thing as cancel culture. He is conflating no form of oppression can be tolerated at any level, with no person who displays any level of oppressive behavior can be tolerated. My point is that you can tolerate a person as a whole without tolerating their specific behavior. We have to remember that people are complex and multidimensional. People aren't just good or bad. Terrible people have positive qualities, and really kind people have negative qualities. Despite my disagreements with Richard, I think he has redeeming content, and I don't think he is a terrible person. Alright, so this video is getting very long, and to be honest, I'm super burnt out of this subject, so I'm going to end it here. If you have any questions about anything I didn't address, feel free to leave a comment. And if you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned for more videos.
Yo, how when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell them say me no eat no fish, nah, no meat now. How when me eat them, I wonder when me yam. When me tell them say that I'm a vegan, man. How when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell them say me no eat no fish, nah, no meat now.